Right, a different environment to usual here. If any of you have had courses with me before, different room at the Crapella. I promise you I'm not in prison, honestly, despite the bars on the window. Okay, so for 601, going through the first session exam, the average mark overall was 8.7 out of 20. The marks ranged from 3 to 17. 39% pass rate, obviously quite different from the homework. A little bit disappointing in some ways, but clearly some people had really not got to grips with the course in many ways and probably just turned up to see what would happen. And that affects, of course, the overall outcome. So, as usual, we'll go through this. Not a model, but some suggestions of things you might have covered on various questions. Question 1, brief answers expected here. As for the homework, the average mark was 4.9. They range from 0.5 for somebody who obviously hadn't had any, not just one person actually, who obviously hadn't got to grips with the course at all, hadn't really read it or had time to follow it. And the maximum mark was 9.5 out of 10. So clearly it is possible at the same time. So, A, the difference between signify and signified in Saussurean terms. This is in the course on page 20. A lot of you gave the example of dog. You obviously remembered this from the course, but there's nothing to stop you having your own example. If you don't like dog, well, why not cat or cow or something, even if it's similar? It just makes my life that much more interesting when I'm marking your work. The point is that there's the word dog, the spoken word or the written word, which is a linguistic form. Then there's also the actual animal or the concept of dog. So the word, if you like, is the signifier, and the signified is the concept of dog. Obviously things are a bit more complicated than that, and Saussure was writing, giving his classes 100 years ago, so things have moved on a bit since then, but still the basic idea is you've got the linguistic form and you've got the real world concept in some way or another. You might think as well that, for example, a dog in France and in Germany and in Britain is pretty much the same thing. We might have slight prototypical differences. Maybe a French person would be more likely to think of a poodle, and maybe a German would be more likely to think of a Dachshund, for example. I don't know, a Rottweiler. But the point is that the basic concept of dog is the same, but the word is very, very different. Dog, Hund, Chien, and so on. So that's the arbitrariness of the sign, which we'll come back to in a later question. B is persons a synonym of people. Again, slightly connected to question 1a. They have a similar denotation. They're talking about the same real-world reference in most cases, but they are different in terms of register, distribution, and so on. So most of you, although you might not know exactly when we use people and exactly when we use persons, the fact that you've got two words suggests that there probably is a difference somewhere. That you're unlikely to have total synonymy within a language or even between languages on basic words like this. You might have technical terms which are very, very close to each other, between French and English, for example. But if English has words persons and people, you probably think there should be a difference somewhere, and there is. If you are more likely to use people, and I hope you are in most cases, then you probably know that persons is likely to be more rare, which is a difference. It makes a difference in the synonymy, if you like, between the two words. It's probably more specialised, more technical, and if you look in a corpus such as the British National Corpus, you'll see that persons is used in very particular registers. Have a go, look at it and see what you find. It's quite fun. And of course there are other things that words can have more than one meaning. So for example, the word people, you can have a people in the sense of un peuple rather than des gens, and you can have peoples in that sense. Obviously you can't have personses, and persons doesn't have that sense at all. You can also have people as a verb, to people, or the city was peopled with, or whatever, I don't know. And you can't do that with persons. You can't say that the city was personsed with, or even personed with. And also you have a sense of person or persons unknown, so it's often legal and so on. So you have the question, does pure synonymy exist at all anyway? C, what are closed classes of words, with examples please. Basically they're things like prepositions, determiners, pronouns, auxiliary verbs, all of those grammar functional words rather than full lexical content words. The point about closed classes of words, if we call them closed classes, it's because they are precisely closed, they're hermetic, they're sealed. It's almost impossible to introduce a new item into one of those classes. You know what the modal auxiliaries are in English. Can you imagine introducing a new modal auxiliary? Well, yes, slowly, probably over decades or hundreds of years, maybe something like gonna will end up as a full modal one day, but it's a long, slow process. You can't just invent a new modal overnight, whereas a noun or a verb or an adjective or even an adverb, you can just invent a new word. So that's the point about closed classes. Which makes greater use of conversion, English or French, and why? Well, first of all, you have to show that you know what conversion is. It's when you have the same word, which basically, without any change, can be in different grammatical classes. So the same word can be a noun or a verb. So a lot of you mentioned import and import. Okay, there's a slight phonological difference in terms of the stress pattern, but it's basically the same word. One is a verb, one is a noun. And you can have also to change and a change. There's no difference there at all. For example, I'm just inventing that. Why is there? So there make greater use of conversion in English than in French. Why? Well, some of you said it's because English is a Germanic language. That may be partly true, but especially it's because in French you have a much richer set of inflections, which indicate, especially for verbs, the part of speech. English doesn't have those typical inflections. We don't have ER, IR, RE, verb endings and so on, like you do in French. So it's easier for a word to simply change category with no formal change at all. Whereas in French, of course you can have, I think the example we had before was le coucher de soleil, coucher de soleil. It does happen, but it's not as frequent in English. It's massively less frequent. Some words with different spellings in British and English. The question is why? A lot of you talked about accommodation. This is not a factor that I can see. Drift, not really, because there are differences in pronunciations. Well, it doesn't matter if you say theatre or theatre. It's not because of the pronunciation difference that they're spelt differently. It's completely independent. Some of you said they were closer to the original. Well, no. In fact, the depends what you mean by original anyway. The CE spelling for defence in English was... the word came from French into English with an S, and it was in English that it changed from an S to a C, and then in American English went back to an S. Theatre comes from French as well, but goes back to Latin where it was also RE, whereas colour comes from French but goes back to Latin where it was OR. So it's not simply a question of what it's closer to in the original, and what do you mean by the original anyway? Is the original British English? Is the original, well, as it was spoken and written 300 years ago? Is the original French, modernish French, or was it Old French, or Norman French, or is the original Latin, or does it go back to Greek, like theatre, or back to Proto-Indo-European, which we can do with colour, for example. So what do you mean by the original? It almost loses its meaning here. It's possibly, the American simpler is possibly simpler in some cases, for example in colour with you have OR rather than OUR, 2 letters are simpler than 3. Possibly more logical, well, not really exactly. I mean, which is more logical, theatre or theatre? E-R-R-E. I don't really see how logic fits in here. Basically, the reason is you had British English, British people, amongst others, went to America, colonised the New World, and so on and so on. But then there was also a question of, well, you've got the mother country and you've got the New World. So some kind of tension there, especially perhaps particularly on the part of the Americans. So wanting to establish an identity, and this is where somebody like Noah Webster comes along, and he was very much in favour of saying, the English as spoken in America, even if we call it English, doesn't have to be subservient to grammarians and lexicographers or what have you in England. It's not because the English do this that we Americans have to do the same thing in terms of spelling, grammar and all the rest of it. And so he was keen to establish a separate identity for American English, and he recommended lots and lots of reforms, almost all of which have not been accepted. You see them occasionally, things like through, THRU, and night, NITE, but the vast majority of them have not become mainstream usage even in America. Some of them have, like the OUR, RE, and in some words like defence as well. So it's because of the work of one man and a group of followers, and then through the Merriam-Webster dictionary and so on. The time was right, and good for them. Okay, moving on to question 2 now. Words taken from Payard claim to be onomatopoeic. So the question is, given an obvious French equivalent for each, the purpose is not to test your knowledge of these words. That's why I gave you the simple definitions from the OALD. But it's a linguistic question. So discuss what this tells us about onomatopoeia. The average mark, was 4.6. Marks range from 2 to 8. So the concept of onomatopoeia, again, as I said, in question 1a, we'd come back to the idea of arbitrariness, and we do. Most words in any language, there's an arbitrary connection between the linguistic form, the signifier, and the real-world concept, or even not real-world concept, but the concept that it refers to. Arbitrary. In the present form, possibly if you go back far enough, you might find that there was a reason for it somewhere. Sometimes the reason is quite recent, but mostly it's invisible. Where you can see some kind of connection today is in the case of onomatopoeia. So you've got a word like, what do we have? Tissue. Sounds a bit like a sneeze. A tissue. Okay? But of course in French you don't say a tissue, you say achum. But they're not the same word. So the point is that even though here we might think the word isn't arbitrary, it still has an element of arbitrariness, but depending on the language it comes into, because it's adapted to the form of the language, and also, why don't English people say achum? We could do. Why don't French people say atichou? We could do, but we don't. So it's a kind of connection. It's not 100% arbitrary, but it's not 100% close to the original either. So yes, there is an element of imitating sounds, but there is also an element still of arbitrariness. Of course, we hear the same thing. If a dog barks and I hear it and somebody Chinese hears it, we both hear the same thing. Our ears aren't different when it comes to things like that. But we might not interpret the sound differently. So there's a difference between hearing and interpretation. Imagine, close your eyes. Imagine that it's midwinter, it's a calm, mild day. You're sitting on the pavement outside a cafe. There's no noise very early in the morning. There's just one very large, big, dry leaf which is on the pavement in front of you. Then suddenly there's a little bit of wind and it makes the leaf move around on the pavement, and then the leaf kind of scratches on the pavement. It makes a kind of noise. Now, how would you write? You can't. But the fact that I'm saying it is already a difference from the real sound, because I can only produce some kinds of sounds. I can't imitate exactly the sound the leaf makes. That's already an interpretation of it. But even I can't write it down because it's not phonemes as such. There's certainly not phonemes which are in a pattern which is possible in English. So that there are different levels of interpretation. So between the real world sound and the actual the word, the onomatopoeia that we say and write, when it becomes a word, lexicalized, rather than that imitation, you might say rustle or scratch or scrape or something like that, or flutter. There's always going to be several levels of interpretation and change. Like the same with a cock's crow. We had cock-a-doodle-doo or cock-a-rico or cock-a-doodle-doo. It's a bit almost childish in English, but still it exists. Cocks or roosters don't speak phonemes. They make a noise. And if you actually hear, if you listen, or of course you can go onto the internet, you can listen to a cock crowing. Try and actually think how, if I tried to approach this with a completely innocent ear, what letters would I write, or what sounds would I write, or if you are sufficiently comfortable with the phonetic alphabet, what phonemes would I write down to try to represent this sound phonetically? Not easy at all. So inevitably there is an element of putting things into possible sequences within the particular language as well. Okay, just to finally say, some people mentioned the bow-wow theory, some people mentioned the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, some people mentioned synesthesia. These are all possible elements which you could develop, but only in detail. It's not the main part of the question. The main part of the question is to say that onomatopoeia is not entirely arbitrary, but it's not entirely predictable either. Okay, question 3. Choice of 2 questions. Please say if it's 3A or 3B. Sometimes I have to read the first paragraph for half a page before I know which one it is, and that makes my job that much harder. The average for question 3 was 8.5. Marks range from 4 to 16 out of 20. Only question 3 was marked out of 20. Questions 1 and 2 were marked out of 10. Okay, so question 3A, nouns that colligate with alleged in the BNC. Okay, so do read the question. The query submitted to the BNC was only for nouns, so there's no point saying we've only got nouns here. I know we've only got nouns here. I told you I only looked for nouns here. That doesn't tell you anything about alleged, because that's all you've got. For example, if you want to buy a car which costs between 15 and 20,000 euros, and you search on the web for cars which only cost between 15 and 20,000 euros, you can't say, oh, but there are no cars which are cheaper than this. Well, because you haven't looked for them. So we simply don't know. All we know is about nouns. I tell you as well that they collocate with alleged within 4 words left and 4 words right, so within an 8-word span, well, 4 words either side. So we don't know about anything further away. I don't tell you that I looked for alleged as an adjective. It might well be a verb, and it is a verb in some of the cases, if you look through all of these. And also because it's a span, we don't know that alleged is necessarily an adjective which is directly next to the noun. It might not even qualify that noun directly. You might have something like the child, full stop, someone alleged. So it might be in a different syntax. So we don't know from what we've got here. Don't read things into what the data don't tell you. Okay, so remember this is a linguistics course. The point is not just to make things up as you go along, and the question is not about alleged. It's what these examples can tell us about the phenomena we're interested in. What are the phenomena we're interested in the question? Collocation and the BNC. The BNC, what is the BNC? It's a corpus, which you should know. You've almost certainly come into contact with it in 503b in translation with me, but we do also mention it in this course. You should know what you can do with the corpus and what you can't do with the corpus. So there's something to be looked at there. Also collocation, what does collocation mean? It means words which typically, frequently co-occur, more frequently than you would expect by chance. So what do we have here? Well, alleged clearly collocates with many negative words. In other words, all of these negative words that we've got, all these violent words that we've got, for example, I have to put out the list here, they give a certain negative colour to the word alleged. Alleged sounds like a negative word because it's often in the company of negative words. Okay, so all of these negative words, they add something to the meaning of the word alleged. Also, it works the other way around, because as soon as you have the word alleged, you expect to have some kind of negative aspect around it. So negative can also colour the other words around it. As soon as you see the word child in the context of alleged, you think, oh, something bad happened to this child, or this child did something bad. Necessarily bad, or almost necessarily bad. Very, very frequently bad. Okay, so what we're talking about here is semantic prosody, or negative semantic prosody in particular. And that's really a concept. I mean, if you got that concept, then you're halfway there. We also see a lot of words which are not just negative in general, but negative specifically in connection with violence or crimes or in a legal context. There's kind of things that you would find in newspapers. When newspapers are dealing with current stories which aren't finished, so often in the context of legal cases when somebody's being tried for something, the trial hasn't finished yet, so the paper can't just say this person is a mass murderer, they have to say alleged mass murderer, and so on. Because we are dealing with current affairs which aren't finished yet, with real people who might not be happy about it if they were called a mass murderer, end of story. They want to be, the journalists need to protect themselves and also to protect the people they're talking about, possibly. Okay, so the second part, if you look at the chart, what it says is that you have 84.94, so 85, occurrences of the word alleged per million words in the newspaper section of the BNC. Okay, what's important is each section of the BNC isn't necessarily exactly the same size, so you need to normalise the occurrences. The bar graphs do that, but what we have, it doesn't matter. If you had a corpus which was 10 times as big, you can't just say, oh look, alleged is much more frequent in this corpus. That tells you nothing. It's the relative frequency. It's frequency per million words or per 10,000 words or whatever. So it's not found so much in speaking or fiction, so we might think it's relatively formal, although some of you thought that because it's in newspapers it's informal, which struck me as a rather odd reasoning. Okay, final thing, a lot of you mentioned dictionaries as well, but remember that dictionaries in almost all cases are essentially descriptive tools. What the lexicographers try to do is to describe language use as it really is. They're not telling people what they should say, although they might think it underneath, because we all have our own preferences and what have you. But what they're trying to do is to describe honestly. And how do they describe? Well, they look at a corpus. So, in other words, what they're doing is looking at a corpus, trying to condense, simplify, put together, find the connections, draw out the patterns and tendencies of the corpus, and that becomes the dictionary entry which they create. So they're doing the work for you. But you can also go straight to a corpus and see things which aren't necessarily put in the dictionary. With a word like alleged, the dictionary might not say it has negative semantic prosody or anything like that. You might see it from the examples, but if there are only one or two examples, how revealing are they? They might just be accidentally negative prosody. Okay. Question 3b. Oh, we're getting on quite well here. Good. Not many of you attempted this. Sometimes some of them were the best answers. Maybe there's some people who didn't know the word alleged. Okay, so what we have here, well, you know what I'm like in these questions in part 3 of the exams and homework. I often have something which talks about people's regular perceptions. Normally they're people who are saying things which are quite extreme and outlandish and simply wrong from a linguistic point of view. They're people's opinions, which they have the right to, but when they actually try to use linguistics to justify what they say, it's wrong. They can have their opinion, but that doesn't mean their opinion is based in fact. Their opinion is based in opinion. So from a linguistic point of view, what these people have to say often simply doesn't hold water. But what we've got here is actually an article which is very reasonable, more reasonable than most of the ones which I would give you in this type of question. And I didn't know at the time, but I've since looked up Ben Yagoda on the internet, and in fact he's a professor of English and journalism in America, which might explain it, although of course English professors and journalist professors can also have opinions which don't necessarily hold much water. I'm sure I do as well, even though I'm always right. So good for him to provide the update, frankly, and quite a well-researched article too. He doesn't take sides too much. He tries to give the facts, remain relatively objective and neutral, which is what I would like to do as well. Sometimes it's more than I can muster, but I'll try. Yes, words do change over time. Change isn't necessarily due to ignorance or misuse. Words change because words change, uses change. There's not necessarily a bad thing in change. Change isn't in itself good or bad, it is simply change. There can be, in some cases, a period of possible confusion if a word has one meaning and over time it changes to a new meaning, which is, if it's a completely new meaning, there probably won't be any confusion at all. If it's a slightly different meaning, there may be a period when there is confusion between the two, but if it's only a slight difference, it's probably not that important anyway. And that's particularly for rare words. For more common words, well, they will change much more quickly in general, whereas the rarer words, that's where we tend to notice perhaps that something slightly strange going on. Usually you would need to be fairly stubborn, pessimistic, and de mauvaise foi to say that, disinterested, meaning with the sense of uninterested, leads to confusion. It wouldn't lead to confusion for most people, only for the pedants would they claim it led to confusion for them, but most of the time the context and the way it was spoken or written and the person who was speaking or writing would make it very, very clear what was meant. So to claim there is ambiguity is really a bit far-fetched in most cases, and it's usually simply just not the case. As I say, mauvaise foi. Dictionaries prescribe usage, as I said before, although some people think they prescribe. You can compare the OED here and the reference to Gowers in this article. You need to be careful a little bit of what everybody knows, and even when you know, I frequently know the etymology of a word or the meaning of a word, and then when I do check in an etymological dictionary, I think, oh right, okay, I hadn't thought of that. Oh right. So do be careful of what you think you know. Often things are not quite that simple, or there could be nuances, and sometimes you're just wrong, and you think a word comes from this place, and in fact it has nothing to do with it at all. It can be completely unconnected. Etymology has tremendous surprises for us often. And that's something which we see in the update from Yagoda here. The crucial point is perhaps what we would call the etymological fallacy, and I included this question because it was similar to a question in the homework. The etymological fallacy means assuming that an earlier meaning is better than a modern meaning, especially if, reductio ad absurdum, you take it back to the original meaning, or the original meaning, if such a thing is possible, is the correct meaning, and any other meaning is false. Now, of course, this is not true, as we've seen, and several of you gave examples which are in the course of nice or silly or wherefore, but with nice and silly, nice doesn't mean today what it meant 1,000 years ago, and it would be wrong today to use it with that meaning, with a 1,000-year-old meaning, because nobody would understand you. The same with silly. If you use silly in the sense of, as we saw in the course, it's connected to modern German selig, so it's blessed or something like that. If you think something is holy or very, very good, and you use the word silly as an adjective, then you might get a slap in the face from the person you're talking to. So the etymological fallacy is a fallacy. It is wrong. You cannot use the etymological fallacy to say that modern usage is wrong. Okay, so the examples in the course on page 26 forward, but don't just put down everything in the neighbouring section here. I'm not quite sure why 2 or 3 people talked about pejoration, for example. I don't see the connection here. What's important is to keep a linguistic perspective and keep relevant. Try to see the different dimensions of the questions, but stay relevant from a linguistic perspective. Okay, so I think we'll stop there. That's pretty much all of it. Congratulations to those who passed, and for those who didn't, see you in the second session.